This is Duke University.
For our final session today, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And let me just make sure I get the right notes out here. I'd like to introduce Elliot Sanchez. Elliot is the founder of M School. His focus is on really reinventing math education. I think in his own journey, working in educational reform, really understanding the difficulty of intervening in institutions which are resistant to change, that have so many things sort of stacked against changing the institution in order to provide that educational experience. And so I think Elliot has taken a very innovative approach in taking on that challenge by creating a model of math education which is mobile, which is modular, and which is micro. So the M of M schools being those three things, really thinking differently about how do you intervene in a school system which may resist change, but in a way that can powerfully open up new opportunities for students to learn math in a new way. It's an early venture, but in our conversations before, Elliot talked about, it's much better to be a cockroach than it is to be a lily. Cockroaches can withstand lots of challenges. They're very opportunistic. They may not be so beautiful, but they're really built to last. And so with that, you also asked me not to raise expectations too high, which I haven't. But I do think that Elliot is doing really great work in thinking creatively about how do you intervene in these difficult institutional environments to find new opportunities that create educational opportunities for students. Elliot, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Let me get this. Perfect. So 5 years ago, I was standing in front of my middle school math classroom at Booker T. Washington Alternative Middle School. It was after Katrina in New Orleans, and we were backed up against the B.W. Cooper housing projects, which no one really went to voluntarily. They'd been condemned, but people continued to live there just for lack of affordable housing in the city, and that's where many of our students were living at the time. We'd been working on a pretty difficult math problem that day, and one of my students, Newman, was sitting right front and center. He was looking very pleased with himself. He'd been struggling a lot, but as they were scribbling their work down and writing the answers on their little whiteboards with their dry erase markers, he had this confidence about him. So I go and I count to 3. Everybody raises their whiteboards. About half the students have the right answer, about half the students have the wrong answer. And Newman's front and center, huge smile, said, F math. And I did give him bonus points for creativity. He actually was a pretty good speller. But I understood where he was coming from. The reason our school was considered an alternative or transitional middle school was because the students had either been expelled from their previous schools, had not succeeded in those traditional environments, or they were so far behind they couldn't stay. Newman, for example, was in 8th grade, but he was 18 years old, and he was doing math at about a 4th grade level. So he's about a decade behind chronologically where you would expect. And once you get to that age, some of the schools don't feel safe with you around the rest of their 8th graders. There are a lot of Newmans out there. In fact, if we look just kind of nationally, what we tend to see is that 1 out of every 3 students is proficient, and the other 2 are not. That's 8th graders across the country. So we have, pick 3 at random, A student, C student, and an F student. That's a striking figure because it's not talking about calculus, it's not talking about college level readiness. That's talking about 8th grade mathematics, basic algebraic understanding, basic functioning in the world where we have bills and where we have coupons and where we have credit scores. As we started to look kind of for context internationally, it's a mixed bag. We have probably a reasonable spot in the top 10. We wouldn't medal, but it doesn't seem too shameful. don't want to be complacent, but that's not actually the whole story, because that is not consistent. If you look at how that breaks down, if you are from an affluent or a middle-income community, you tend to be okay, or your schools are doing pretty well giving you the basic math instruction. If you come from an income community in poverty, you are almost getting the education you would get in Slovakia. And it is an incredible thing to think that those 8th graders are being failed so consistently based on the structure of the system that put them there. So after this experience with Newman, it became clear to me that as hard as he worked, it was not going to be enough to be a great teacher. And at that point, I decided I would make my professional work in education about this question. I think it's a fair one, and I also now think it is completely the wrong one, because I've come to believe pretty strongly that the most important part about the work in education is that we need to fix education, and that may not necessarily mean having to fix schools. Now, this is not a common opinion, but it is one that I believe very firmly, and I'd like to tell you the story of how I got here. So a few years after I left the classroom, I went to go work at the Louisiana Department of Education in the Superintendent's Delivery Unit. It was an internal consulting team, and much like most consultants, our job was to say the things that pretty much everybody already knew but didn't want to say. And because of that, we were tasked with keeping the cabinet members accountable to a plan. So this is the actual slide that we used for the state superintendent and the legislature when we had to report. Basically, this was our projection. We were in 2010. We knew that the last year there were 62% of students that were basic or above, means they were passing. Means that we were almost at the 2/3 you would expect if it was a random sample nationally. And we were trying to get that passing rate up to 68%. Now, you notice on the left axis, we have it actually in real student terms. We thought it was important to keep it very focused on the fact that these are actual individual students that we were trying to reach. And we said, if we do nothing, that's about a 1% increase every year. 62, we predicted 63 that year and 64 the next year, just with our kind of historic progress. Then the idea was to go through, and these acronyms are the list of the most effective, most research-driven programs we could find in the state. University partnerships, these are human capital training programs, cross-curricular components. These are pairing high-performing schools with low-performing schools to share best practices. This is the most innovative models we had. And what we said is we maxed out the budget for STEM education in the state. Where would that get us? How far could we get to the goal? And with that work, with the best things we could come up with, we almost would get halfway to where we wanted to be. This was a really sobering moment for me, because what it showed was that I just always assumed, being in the classroom, that there were all of these crazy things going on at the state, and if we could just get up there and get it straightened out, we would be able to do the right thing and make it work. And somehow, it still wasn't going to work, and doubling our budget was not an option. So the question was, why? Why did those things happen? I'm going to get some water? Matt, thank you. I came to believe pretty strongly that the actual issue was the fact that our classrooms were constraining our growth. And I think this is very clearly tied back to the fact that if you go and look when public education took the form it has today, mid-19th century, we used the most advanced social technology we had at the time, the industrial factory model. It was one that was standardized. We went from one-room schoolhouses to a group of 30 kids who were all the same age, who were expected to learn the same thing at the same time. It's a basic form of quality control, except for the fact that people don't all learn the same and the same thing at the same time. Because of that, it left us in a very strange position. It meant that all of the things that were supposed to make us better were also trying to make that work happen better in the context of a very rigid framework. There was one notable exception. As we started to do this research, we came across a very small pilot on something that at the time I'd never heard of before, software with adaptive personalization. It's very buzzwordy now, but first time I'd been exposed to it. Basically just meant that you had computer programs, but instead of them being electronic versions of textbooks or flashcards or something, the students would come in, they'd take a test, and if they got the first question wrong, the next one would be easier. If they got the first question right, the next one would be harder. And in about 20 questions, you can get a fairly robust estimate of where that student is. And you can get out the specific gaps in their knowledge. So if the student is missing something in fractions, you can identify that, and that won't necessarily mean they're at a 4th grade level if they know everything else from 5th grade. So we went through, and just as an example, right, student A comes in, knows everything, takes about 5-6 steps to get through the unit. They get all of the knowledge they needed. If a student B comes in, takes the first one, gets the second module, cannot pass it, they're rerouted back to something that's more appropriate, fill in that gap, go on to the next one. And every time there's a mistake, it will reroute you through a learning path that is adapted to your individual needs. This is very different than the technology we'd had previously, which was about replicating the industrial model in electronic form. This was something that was very new. It was responsive in a way that previously only teachers had been responsive. It also meant that we had a big change in the way that the classrooms would look. There'd be a lot more technology. And the most telling part is that the teacher's job has changed dramatically. The teacher's monitoring data, they're curating content sources, they're working within this framework. But importantly, their job is very different than it was before, and it's very different than what they signed up for or were trained for. So based on these small samples, we pulled as much data as we could, meta-analysis of all the other states that we'd seen this adaptive software in place, and the results were kind of striking. If we spent a small fraction of the money that we'd spent on any of the other interventions next year, it looked like we could reach our goal plus some, and that would set us up as a proof point to continue to expand. I was in the uncomfortable position then of explaining how this worked to a superintendent who had thought we were nowhere near, and the best I could come up with was this. The quality or amount of a student's learning is going to be based on the quality of the instruction and their readiness to learn it. So to give you an example, when I was with Newman, I was a perfect 10 in terms of instruction quality. You'll have to take my word for it. What that meant was that I could be as good as I wanted, but what I'd mistaken is that in that equation, we'd covered exponents, we'd covered basic algebraic reasoning, we'd solved equations, but by combining them in that way and teaching a whole lesson before I got his input, what I realized is I'd assumed a knowledge of square roots and working square roots into solving that algebraic equation as well. And when that happened, I'd made a misstep. About half the class had been behind, hadn't gotten it, and a few students learned it that day, and the other half were already way past me. And so the one for the readiness, I would say Newman definitely picked up some vocabulary that day for sure. But on the other hand, let's say I had a much worse instructional resource, but one that was much closer to where he was ready to be. This is a metaphor, but it's actually pretty close to what we actually see in the trials. Meeting in the middle, there's a nonlinear relationship in how much learning goes on. And so I was then in the position of telling the state superintendent that I thought we should go with the lower quality learning option that would mess up all of the plans of everyone else in his department for STEM. The response was, well, what do these people do? And I said, well, the job was to get the students to learn the material. I didn't know we were planning for what to do with them, but I mean, I'm sure we can come up with something. We need some substitute teachers. It was a difficult conversation because it raised uncomfortable questions, and there was really no way to make it fit neatly within the framework that we'd already invested so much time and effort in. Because that framework was designed to support the structures we had already had in place, as opposed to making the students' learning maximized no matter what. They didn't take the suggestion. Turns out, superintendent resigned 6 weeks later. There was 6 months of transition. And the only real lesson that came out of it was that we were really good at predicting baselines. That was with the state of Louisiana's growth over those years. So we were at 64% in 2012. We'll get the results back this next year. For 2013, looking like 66%. So that was basically the moment where I became dissatisfied with working in policy anymore. It was not the magic bullet that I assumed it would be. And my next thought was, well, who actually makes the calls that can override the policy people? It's the politicians. So I began working in campaigns. I managed 2 election cycles. Last cycle, I managed 5 races. We won 4 of them. We actually had a majority on the board. It turns out, though, that even if people agree with you and they are completely well-intentioned, it's hard for a politician to vote for something that they know will make them lose their job. If you tell someone that you can maximize the students' learning in an abstract sense, but in a very concrete sense, they will lose their job or it will change drastically, it's a hard call to make. Well, it's not as hard as you would think, actually. There was almost no, now, there's other avenues. We asked for the district schools to take this model on first, did not work, so we said there are other models of charter schools out there, right? Rocket ship education is a great example, right? They do a blended model from the ground up, so everyone who comes in has signed on, they know what they're getting into. The issue, though, is that with starting a new school every time you want to do this, you have a 6-month period to be approved generally as a charter, and then it takes about 2 years to get started, about $250,000 in costs to locate a facility, to pay salaries for people until you've actually started accepting students and being funded for them. And you still have to train teachers who are coming in, even if they know what they're getting into, that their job will be different than it was before, because it's not the training they received when they became teachers to begin with. So, dejected, I was actually volunteering at Apex Youth Center, Washington and Earhart in the Broadmoor neighborhood of New Orleans. Apex stands for Always Pursuing Excellence. This is Danny Fitzpatrick. Him and his wife Lisa run this amazing center. They are Methodist ministers that basically left their former church, moved to the inner city, paid their whole life savings to start a building where kids could drop in at any moment and just be someplace. It was dangerous outside. If they wanted a place to be, they knew they could be there and be safe. While I was there, I ran into Newman, actually. He had, a year later, passed the 8th grade exam. Fantastic. He was in high school. He was 20 years old, and he was still struggling with math. So I said, hey, Newman, can I get you one of these? I said, you can keep it after you're done. We paid $100 for the first Android tablet. Android because it runs Flash, or did. But we got it to him. He started playing with the games. He liked it. Some other kids saw it. They wanted to do it as well. We essentially ran a pilot. And at that point, I was getting these results. I met the people at 4.0 Schools in New Orleans, which is a fantastic incubator that's designed specifically to get educators from a hunch they have to an actual enterprise. So I went through the program, and after seeing it in action for the first few weeks, I quit my job. This is Apex at the top. You'll see we have students who are playing these games, quote unquote, next to the pool table, across from the basketball court. They are there spending about 2 hours every day after school with a math class to do more math for no credit, for no money. They're just there because they're curious. They want to learn. We want to learn as people. And now they have something that will actually give them the content at any moment that's appropriate for them. This pilot's at TCC, Trinity Christian Community, Holly Grove, about 5 minutes from my house. It's where the rapper Lil Wayne is from. And this is first and third graders in the program. Again, they are coming after school. They're doing 2 hours of math. There's no incentive except, we did tell them at the end of the year if they stuck with us, they could keep the tablets. But that means they're putting in 300-400 hours at least of extra math work. And the majority of our hours are logged after they go home at night from their home computers. They're spending more time voluntarily at home after homework for every other subject that is counting this year to go and work on more math because they are learning and they are feeling successful for the first time. When that happens, what we saw was that the centers themselves said, how can we do this more? So we took this pilot, we took the results, and we actually applied directly to the state of Louisiana for accreditation. Became, in December, the first credit granting institution that we know of in the country that offers a blended classroom with a social franchise, which means that we are the accredited entity, but someone else is operating it. Someone who is in the community, knows the community, has the relationships, knows the kids, and the kids are already there voluntarily. This would be a nice blip on the radar, a nice data point about what we could do, except for the fact that we think we have a fundamental advantage over other people who are trying to bring blended learning to schools and to students. Because if you think about Rocket Ship, those costs are sometimes prohibitive. To give you an example, Rocket Ship has been approved for 8 charters in the state of Louisiana simultaneously based on their great track record. 8 charters were approved last year. Their first will open potentially in 2014 if it does, because the costs are so great to get started. It's a fantastic model, but it's just not fast enough. With our model, we can send a box to the centers. We can have someone go from absolutely no experience to a fully functional, accredited school in 2 weeks for $2,500. All of these things are designed for the first time to make the actual content immediately accessible to someone with no training. It is designed to meet all of the community centers exactly where they are. And there is no incentive in the current system to do that with our resources. We are selling to schools, but we are not selling to the people who actually could take control with adaptive resources. So just, again, it's nice to know that the academics work, but the most critical data point for us has been to see the fact that it has become their own. These units of change are small. They're only a third of a school day, so students would leave at 1 instead of 3 to come to the center, and they'd stay the normal amount of time till the evening. This is the annual fundraising letter that Trinity Christian Community sent out. has their students, some of the other activities. There's sections on their senior outreach and some of the home building they've done. But importantly, the M School is their M School. It's the one that they operate. It is the one that is in their community that they have ownership over. When this happens, what we've done is we've simultaneously brought these high-quality academics that are previously only very limited availability. Only 100 schools out of 100,000 in the United States have this kind of blended lab rotation model. But we brought it to these students where they are. And before we'd even had a chance to collect our first data, they had been tracking the data in the program themselves. I'm going to blow this little paragraph up so you can see it. This is a typical result from what we've seen. This was not a blip. We've been not quite finished with our first academic year, but these results have happened to almost every student we've had who came and just put the hours in, who was there long enough with the time on task. At this rate, students who are coming from communities 100% free and reduced lunch, communities in poverty, the students who are getting the developing world education now for the first time can catch up to their peers and exceed their peers in performance. We are potentially at the place where we can say that we know if a student comes to us in 4th grade, they can have high school algebra credit by the time they're in 8th grade. This is the reason why I think we can't wait for schools. We have a responsibility to get the students the education they deserve. We know we are not doing it. We have built a system, invested billions of dollars, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into a system that was designed to provide students education, but is now potentially, at this moment, with the technology we have, getting in the way of that. We are a new organization. Hopefully we'll have a big enough sample size to publish results next year. We're still looking for people who want to work with us. But the important part is that we think we are the first of a small but growing contingent of people who see these tools not just as a way to improve education for students, but also to make education something that is fundamentally owned by the students, owned by the communities, in a way that keeps the promise. And that is worth getting education to the students, even if we can't wait for the schools themselves. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.